We'll get started. If everyone's got your lunch ready, we're really in for a treat today. My name's Amanda Lyons. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center here at the Law School. And we're really glad to welcome you to this special event together with the International Law Society. In addition to the panel that we're convening today, we're going to hear some opening remarks from Professor Gienger, who is in Brussels, I believe. It's like, where is Carmen San Diego? This is really a great chance to hear from some of the editors and experts at Lawfare and also at Just Security, which if you are not following these online spaces, you should. And I'm guessing that today's conversation will convince you of that. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Alan if we've got everything working. Can you hear us okay?
Yeah, it's perfect. And yeah, I am in Brussels and really sorry not to be with you all today, but here also to do some work around the current situation of Ukraine and in particular the importance of maintaining European solidarity and support with the country of Ukraine at this really perilous time. I had the privilege to visit Lviv in Ukraine in December 2023. This was to celebrate and acknowledge multiple anniversaries, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the Genocide Convention's anniversaries. And I think with Viola, many of us at Just Security and also at Lawfare have written extensively on the legal, political, and other aspects of the conflict in Ukraine. And for me in particular, the gendered cost of this war have remained at the forefront of my thinking and of my conversations. We count the costs of this war in economic terms, in social terms, in military terms, but most of all in terms of the human loss and emotional toil of a country at war for now 3 years. I want to recall as we open this event the remarks made by Ambassador Martin Kimani of Kenya at the Security Council on the 27th of February 2023. He said, "Many of us don't like our borders." He was the ambassador of Kenya. He said, "Many of us don't like our borders. We didn't choose them. But the compact of post-World War II is that we accept the prohibition on the movement of borders without consent of the state." And that statement remains as true then as it does now. It's particularly important that we keep international law to the fore of this conversation and that we remember the costs of what it means to break international law, including the anniversary this weekend of the bombing of the drama theatre at the Mariupol city. It's really important, I think, that Lawfare and Just Security are coming together. Really, part of the coming together is to underscore the importance of the situation in Ukraine and our attention to it as Americans, not just in capitals, but across the country, including in the Midwest. And I'm particularly grateful to my colleague and friend, Professor Alan Rozenshtein, who steered the ship and got everybody here and is chairing this session, but also to thank the Human Rights Center, Amanda and Abby in particular, for making this work and for so many of you to show up the first day after spring break. So thank you all, and I look forward to hearing the conversation too. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. I'm so grateful and our panelists for making the trek here. I'm glad they got what counts in Minnesota for early spring weather. It's going to hit 60 degrees today, so that's something. As Professor Nolan mentioned, yesterday was the third anniversary of the bombing of the Mariupol Drama Theater, an event in which Russian forces struck a building sheltering civilians despite clear satellite imagery showing the Russian word "did" that's written there, meaning children, written prominently outside. To mark this anniversary, there was a rally yesterday organized by the Twin Cities Ukrainian community at the State House. So I'm glad I get to put a slightly nicer, more pleasant picture here. This happened yesterday. Here's another picture, so I think we're just going to leave that as a looming omnipresence over our discussion. I'm very grateful for you all to be here today so that we can discuss the war that is entering into its fourth year. I'm going to very briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to just jump straight in because there's quite a lot to discuss, and I want to make sure to leave plenty of room for questions. So we have Anastasiia Lapatina here. She is our Lawfare's Ukraine Fellow. Just firsthand experience as a national reporter at the Kyiv Independent, has a wonderful Substack called Yours Ukrainian that I really encourage you all to read. Seated next to her is Tyler McBrien. He's the managing editor at Lawfare, previously an editor at the Council on Foreign Relations. Together, Tyler and Nastia have released, and I'm biased because I work with them at Lawfare, what I think is truly an exceptional piece of documentary audio journalism. This is a podcast that we're calling Escalation, which is a narrative history of the U.S.-Ukrainian relations going, back to the end of the Cold War and up to the present moment. We just released our fourth episode today, and so you can subscribe to it wherever you listen to podcasts. But I think it's really a terrific resource. And then finally, rounding out our panel, we're very lucky to have Viola Gienger. She's the Washington Senior Director at Just Security. She's a longtime journalist who spent several years in the post-Soviet region, spent a few years in Belarus in the 1980s, and we'll talk about that experience and how it informed how she's been thinking about the war in Ukraine. And most recently, or recently also conducted research and program strategy work on Russia's 2014 invasion of Ukraine at the U.S. Institute of Peace before moving to Just Security, where she is an editor and has been for several years now. I want to divide our discussion into sort of three categories of questions, right? This event is billed as a discussion of the past, present, and future of U.S.-Ukraine relations. So that's a nice structure to use. So we'll start with the historical context, and then we'll talk about the current state, what's going on with U.S.-Ukraine relations, and then we'll spend some time thinking about what the future might hold. So let's begin with the historical context. Let me start with you, Nastia, though everyone should jump in as we discuss. Can you walk us through, and keeping in mind that we only have 50 minutes, sadly, in 60 seconds, could you please walk us through the key milestones of U.S.-Ukraine relations? I'm not going to have you start with Kyiv and Rus. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Well, let's just start with Ukrainian independence in 1991. And then I should say, this is really, this is a shameless plug. You really all should listen to this podcast. It's extremely.
Thank you. I agree. I am the co-host, and I think it's very good. Well, thank you for bringing me here. It's amazing. Okay. The history of U.S.-Ukraine relations. So, as we covered in the podcast called Escalation, that's available everywhere, the relationship really starts when the Soviet Union falls apart in 1991. And from there, Ukraine is playing a bit of an awkward role, I'd say, because and this will be a theme, and I think right now it remains a theme of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, that it's never just about the United States and Ukraine. It's always about the United States, Russia, and then a little bit of Ukraine. And so we tried to really tell this story in the podcast as much as possible without Russia, but Russia kept third wheeling, as I would joke. And that's one of the big motifs of the relationship, and one of its biggest problems as well. Because from the very beginning, the United States government has always looked at Ukraine through this lens of Moscow, and American officials would talk to people in Moscow about decisions that were being made vis-a-vis Kyiv and vis-a-vis Ukraine. And so one of the big, very important moments in the relationship is the fact that Ukraine is pressured by both Russia and the United States to give up its nuclear weapons after it gained independence in 1981. And at that time, Ukraine has the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world sitting on its territory. And we are forced to give it up. And a very interesting agreement is struck in the middle of that. It's called Budapest Memorandum, and it's something that every Ukrainian has an opinion on, like no American knows what it's even about. And in that agreement, we agreed to give up nuclear weapons in exchange for what we see as Ukrainians as security guarantees from the U.S., that the U.S., the U.K., which was also party to the treaty, and Russia, that the three of those states guarantee Ukraine's security, Ukraine's territorial integrity. In the English text of the document, the wording was security assurances. And, assurances versus guarantees, from that all hell breaks loose in the decades to come in that disagreement.
Say more, actually. That's a great part of the episode.
Especially for legal minds.
Yeah, especially for legal minds. But this is like a nice example of where wordsmithing, which is always something that lawyers care about, becomes extremely important and 10 times more complicated because you are dealing with literally 3 different languages. So just say more about what was happening.
Yes. So the Budapest Memorandum, this treaty that's signed, which we did have a debate about whether it's even a treaty to begin with. The wording there says that in the Russian, there was a Russian language version, a Ukrainian language version, and an English language version. And in the Ukrainian and Russian languages, it said that the UK, Russia, and the US were guaranteeing, the word was guarantee, Ukrainian security. And that was very important to Ukrainian diplomats because, we were giving up all of these nuclear weapons, which is, an extremely important asset. And a bunch of money as well. And so they needed to present to the domestic audience that, hey, we negotiated a strong document, something that guarantees our security going forward, because the Ukrainian government was already very acutely aware of a threat that Russia was posing back then. The Russian threat didn't just show up randomly in 2014, it's been there for centuries. But of course, for American diplomats, the word guarantee was a non-starter. And that was said plainly and openly, and everyone knew it. And so we've actually spoken for the podcast with some of the diplomats who were involved in the negotiation of that memorandum. And they said that, we can't use the word guarantee because the guarantee is what we give our NATO allies. And there's no way in hell that we are going to give a guarantee like that to Ukraine, which in American minds is a new country that, America and Ukraine don't even have really an established relationship yet. So they opt for a word assurances, which is a very vague word, and it's a much less strong, it's a lesser, less strong word than guarantee. And so basically, Ukraine and the US end up signing something like 2 different documents because the translations are different. And from that point on, the countries have a very different interpretation of what is meant by the document, and they expect different things of each other. And a lot of hostility ends up brewing on the Ukrainian side because we feel betrayed, right? We feel that, clearly nobody guaranteed our security going forward. And so it's a very interesting discussion that we had with a bunch of diplomats who were involved in this negotiation about whether the US lived up to it or no.
Let me jump in there for a second. I want to ask Tyler as well, because you did put the podcast together with Nastia, and you talked to a lot of these folks. To me, and I'm very much a layperson here, I'm trying to kind of channel the interested but somewhat clueless American. That's kind of my role in this discussion.
Yeah, that's my role.
Yeah, exactly. You're not so clueless anymore after doing all this work. To me, everything is downstream of the Budapest Memorandum, right? I mean, that is the pivotal choice, right? And you can argue about the merits of that at the time, and I think you two do a great job of talking about what was at stake there, and it was a huge non-proliferation victory in a certain sense, right? I think some of the more poignant parts of that episode in particular is the regrets that a lot of folks, some of which you talked to, some of which, like President Bill Clinton, you did not talk to, but there's some great excerpts from interviews there. How do just say a little bit about how the people you talked to reacted or have reacted to the last few years and what their view of the Budapest Memorandum is in your insight.
Yeah, I totally agree. The Budapest Memorandum is a perfect microcosm of the history of US-Ukraine relations. And just really briefly, in making the show and covering these points in US-Ukraine history, you get this sense of it. What brings to mind for me is there's now a sort of famous scene from the show Mad Men, which has now become a meme where there are 2 guys in an elevator. One guy says to the other, "I feel really bad for you," and the other guy says, "I don't think about you at all." And it sounds harsh, but a lot of the diplomats we spoke to at the time really said our chief objective was to get rid of nuclear weapons. Everything was vis-a-vis Russia. I mean, as Nastia was saying, it was through Russian lenses. And so the Budapest Memorandum from the American view, so we spoke with Steve Piper, who was one of the top diplomats helping to negotiate this. He is one of the few people who doesn't have a regret because from his perspective, we accomplished what is important to U.S. national interests at the time, which was denuclearization. And by the way, the Ukrainians couldn't really launch the nuclear weapons because the technology to launch them was still in Moscow. They're also very expensive to maintain. There are a lot of things that, and the Ukrainians got economic incentives to give them up. But then we spoke to a woman named Sarah Sievers, who was a young foreign service officer at the time. An amazing interview. She was there fresh out of graduate school, I think, helping to write the new Ukrainian constitution. But she also was there for the Budapest Memorandum negotiations. And she feels a lot of regret because of what happened and because of what the Ukrainians were telling the Americans at the time, saying, we will not be secure without a guarantee. And I think they kind of took what they could get at the time with limited options. I just wanted to add one more point to Nasti's point about whether it's a treaty or not. The Ukrainians, I believe, really wanted it on treaty paper, official fixed paper.
It fell or something, right? It's really fancy.
And it wasn't working with the printer.
Yeah, the printer was jamming.
It was a whole thing because the optics were very important.
Right. But I think you're right. It is the perfect encapsulation because there's misunderstandings here. There's misaligned interests. There's U.S. attention being everywhere but Ukraine, seemingly. Yeah. And then there is, I think, another fault of the U.S. in the history of U.S.-Ukraine relations is this intentional ambiguity to Ukraine's detriment. So everyone at the time knew about this mistranslation, seemingly. It was intentional, I think, on the Americans' part, and also the Ukrainians and the Russians knew that the authoritative document was the English one, and yet, they still accepted. And I think there's this trend of the United States living up to about 90% of its commitment, but leaving 10% for more room to operate, and it's in that 10% that Russia can exploit what's happening.
Viola, I want to turn to you, and I'd love for you to sort of help us situate these negotiations and this diplomacy, which obviously, from Ukraine's perspective, is so important, but from Russia and the United States' perspective, maybe the global community's perspective at the time, was one part of a much, much broader story, right? Of the end of the Soviet Union, an incredibly tricky transition that, at least in the 90s, seems like it had gone surprisingly well, actually, and then obviously, goes until it didn't, right? You were living in Belarus for a while in the late 80s, right? So, or was it late 80s or early 90s, if I'm right?
Late 90s.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, the late 90s, right? So you were in that region. Can you just talk sort of more broadly about what was happening in U.S. post-Soviet relations at the time? Just contextualize this story.
Sure. I think there was at the time a lot of optimism about what the world could be in a post-Cold War environment. There were extensive efforts, in fact, by the United States and the Europeans in NATO to bring Russia on board. Not to isolate or ignore Russia, although Russia felt a loss that I think a lot of Americans and Europeans didn't really grasp the depth of that, the feeling of loss. I was in Belarus from 1997, early 97 to January of 99. And during that time, I got there 3 months after Lukashenko had rigged a referendum to strip powers from the Supreme Court and the Parliament and began to consolidate his dictatorship. It was slow going at first, but behind the scenes, he was starting to do things like, what we now know of as a standard authoritarian playbook, start to repress independent media, start to take control of certain media outlets, information channels. And all of this was playing out. He was seen as the last dictator in Europe at the time, and still to a certain extent was for decades thereafter. The opposition in Belarus tried to rise up at that point, but it was weak. It was divided. It didn't really know how to organize because that had not been a thing for decades. And so in the meantime, the rest of the former Soviet Union and the former Eastern Bloc was trying to adjust to what democracy advocates there wanted which was a democratic, rule of law based system. It was a wrenching transition, not to mention the economic transition to capitalism from central control. I didn't understand when I first went to Belarus, and most most Westerners did not understand that this was a 180-degree shift in politics, in economics, in societal relationships among each other, and in relationships among countries. And so there continued to be this sort of, zero-sum game and zero-sum thinking in a lot of ways. That was the larger context. The transition was absolutely wrenching. In my particular field, I'm a career journalist, so I went over there first on a Knight International Press Fellowship to support independent media who were trying to adjust to the role of the media in a democratic society, not controlled by the central government. But at the time, the idea of independent media de facto became opposition media in any of those countries where the government was resisting independence of any. So in Belarus, for example, and in some cases in other parts of the former Soviet Union, there was an effort by the authorities to continue to control the environment in any possible way, whether it was private enterprise, independent media, civil society, God forbid. So all of these organizations that grew up after independence immediately began to be seen as threats to the powers that be. Eastern Europe, some of the countries that were part of the Eastern Bloc but not part of the Soviet Union had more familiarity with democratic systems, with the rule of law, and had a much greater sort of background and grounding in and desire for that kind of system. In the former Soviet Union, there was more ambivalence, partly because of the economic issues. So all of these issues were very much intertwined, and I can't express to you how difficult that transition was on a political level as well, and on a way of how people and organizations relate to each other.
So yeah.
Just to add from a bit of a more Ukrainian perspective on this as well, is something that we knew but also heard a lot of Americans talk about while reporting on the show, is that when the Soviet Union fell apart, there was this assumption in the American government that the problem with the Soviet Union and with the Eastern European region was communism. And so that's gone. And now Russia can become this new reformed entity. There were great hopes for Russia becoming democratic and prosperous. And there wasn't really an appreciation for the fact that the region has a very deep history that's centuries long, that, actually isn't necessarily connected just to communism. It's a story of Russian imperialism that's centuries long.
George Kennan understood this in his famous telegram that he wrote, and yet this was the famous, Cold War diplomat in the United States who wrote the famous X telegram, right? He understood this, and yet no one else in the United States government seems to have understood that that communism was only a recent manifestation of Peter the Great, and going all the way back hundreds and hundreds of years.
And so that Russian colonialism and those attitudes and those dynamics in the political and economic relationships, all of that stayed and remains clearly to this day, because Ukraine used this war as an imperial war, as a war of conquest. And so that, just the lack of appreciation there, and the lack of understanding of Russian colonialism and that history was very strong.
I want to go back to you, Viola, for a second, because I think we could spend the entire time talking about the past, but I want to get to the present. But there's one more historical point that's important. I want to ask you, Viola, because you spent a lot of time researching this when you were at the Institute for Peace, and that's fast forwarding to the first Russo-Ukraine war, right? Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014. Can you just very briefly describe what happened, and then maybe even more importantly, how the reaction of the international community, such as it was, set the stage for what then happened 8 years later?
Yeah, it was the capture practically overnight of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass region, eastern Ukraine. And that caught the international community very much off. It shouldn't necessarily have. In 1998, I took my first trip to Ukraine and had the opportunity to work with young journalists in Crimea. And even at that time, the Russians were handing out passports in Crimea, trying to build a pro-Russian community there and doing their propaganda and their disinformation. Disinformation is a word that has been in the lexicon for us only in the last maybe 10 years at most, maybe 5 more likely. But it was going on long before then. And they were handing out these passports. So there were already signs of Russian designs on Crimea that long ago. Fast forward to 2014, so we're 16 years later. And so this has been developing over time. We missed the signs or ignored the signs. So that's really important. And I think that's particularly important going forward. Vigilance is a word that keeps coming to my mind, is to keep an eye out in all directions for signs of shifting allegiances, shifting strategies, tactics, etc. So in 2014, when the invasion, when Russia captured Crimea so suddenly, I remember sitting in a meeting with some former ambassadors, and there were signs already at that point that Russia would go into eastern Ukraine as well. And one of those ambassadors says, "Oh, that there's no interest in their doing that. They know that wouldn't be acceptable." And my question, I verbalized at the time, is, who's going to stop them? And the silence was kind of like in this room. And that was the issue. The international community was so slow to respond in that instance. It took months and months. It wasn't until that summer. So the Maidan revolution in Ukraine started late fall, winter of 2013, extended into early 2014.
And if I may, this is just quickly, this is a pro-democracy movement that is understood probably both accurately and especially in Moscow's perspective as a move of Ukraine trying to turn to the West, or at least trying to turn from the East. And so this is kind of a thing that further sets Moscow off.
And the Ukrainian government at the time had suddenly shifted its allegiance to Moscow. And the Ukrainian public wasn't having that. They spent a lot of time fighting for democracy, and they weren't going to give it up now. And they showed that and mobilized in an unprecedented way, impressive way, peacefully. And then there was an attack by the government forces against the protesters, and that inflamed what happened next. But and then Putin came into eastern Ukraine. And even then, the Europeans and the United States were waffling. We're like, what are we going to do? Are we going to do sanctions? I mean, really, what is there to think about? The situation was very clear, but U.S. and European investment in Russia was very deep and very expensive at that time. And that had a big role to play in the decision-making, especially in Europe, but also in the United States to a certain extent. And it wasn't until that summit that the first sanctions were imposed. And even after that, for years thereafter, every 6 months in Europe, the European Union had to decide whether to re-up sanctions. And there was always this debate. Will they do it? Will they do it? Will Germany come on board? Now, to Germany's credit, they re-upped the sanctions every single time. That was a different kind of surprise and a kind of a more pleasant surprise. So the bottom line there is we were caught off guard. We were not watching the signs. We weren't listening to the Ukrainians, and much less some of the other countries around the broader region. And what we understood at the time, what some of us understood at the time, was that dictators all around the world would be watching the European and US reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and calibrating their responses accordingly. And we saw a very weak response for many years that finally ended up in the full-scale invasion in 2014.
So that, I think at the risk of having this panel sounds so one-sided, to give some of the reasons behind the distrust and the not listening to the Ukrainians is partly an arrogance and a prejudice against Ukrainians that started from the beginning. So we spoke with diplomats then, American diplomats then, who said that there was this pervasive feeling among the diplomatic corps that at the time of independence that the Ukrainians, one person used the word like country bumpkins, and that the real diplomatic deal makers were the Soviets who were back in Moscow, and can we bring them back because we know how to deal with them and they're the familiar enemy. But at the same time, there are points in the 10 to 15 years after independence of serious scandals of corruption in Ukraine. There was a grisly murder of a journalist, Georgy Gungadze, and we interviewed his wife on the podcast. And so there were worrying signs coming out of Ukraine, but it was also mixed with this like Soviet hangover that American diplomats had that just persisted.
Yeah, that's totally right. There were mistakes done on both sides, and we thoroughly uncover those mistakes in the show. That Ukraine at times acted a bit like Moscow, and we looked very autocratic, very corrupt, and there were very dark periods in our history as well that definitely didn't provide for a very effective cooperation with the U.S. as well.
So now let's get to this current conflict, right? So Lawfare has I'll stop plugging Lawfare in a second, I promise, but it's a professional obligation of mine. So Lawfare has a weekly podcast called Rational Security. It's our kind of like more relaxed kind of chat show. And there was a period in the sort of run up and then in the first weeks of the war in 2022, when that's all we talked about. And I went back because I was one of the sort of regular co-hosts at the time, and I went back to sort of re-listen to some of those conversations. They're a really interesting time capsule, right? Where as you get closer and closer to the war, we're getting more and more nervous, right? Because the satellite reports of Putin massing tanks on the border, and will he, won't he? And I don't know, the Ukrainians don't seem very prepared, and everyone seems kind of relaxed about this. And then the week that it happens, and it's like, well, it was a nice country while it lasted, right? Because no one thought, just no one thought, right, that this was going to end in anything other than tanks in Kiev within a week or two. But then the first week doesn't quite go as well, and you hear these reports of the advanced stalling in the second week, right? And so you can see it here in real time, being like, I don't know, maybe something's going to happen here, right? What is happening here? And then, within a few months, you realize this is going to be a real quagmire for the Russians, right? And so I want to ask, and I'll go to you, Tyler. Can you compress, if you can, the 2.5 years of the Biden administration and the West's response to Russia's invasion? Because in many ways, it was far more than people thought would happen. In many ways, it was far less than what was necessary. But it was a remarkable geopolitical moment, right? And so you have 90 seconds.
Fear of escalation. No, I mean, that's absolutely right. Interestingly, the seemingly the only community that did see this coming and tried to scream it from the rooftops was the U.S. intelligence community in terms of strategically leaking some of the intelligence. And there was reporting that suggested that even Zelensky didn't believe it, but still mobilized anyway. So it caught people off
He
guard.
didn't believe his own intelligence community,
He
or
didn't
even they
believe
were.
the US intelligence that it was happening, that it was imminent. And so that's one thing. I think there's a really interesting dynamic at play where Americans probably see the U.S. support for the Ukrainian military as doing all that we can do. We've given billions, weapons. We've done everything short of triggering World War III with the Russians and nuclear annihilation. Whereas I think you both are right. Ukrainians also see this as lots of strings attached to the aid. They couldn't use long-range weapons. They couldn't actually fight back the way. And if they could, if they were given these weapons unrestricted, then they would have turned the tide of war earlier. May also be true. And so it's funny. There's talk about like the Ukrainians have an idea of something that is a big betrayal, and then the Americans have no idea what it is. I think a lot of Americans probably don't know the name Jake Sullivan, but he is like one of the most hated people in Ukraine because of his role in the war. But
and Jake Sullivan was, just for if folks in this room may not know who Jake Sullivan is.
Yeah, I mean, he was I guess he was running point on Ukraine.
That's what people think. But
So he was the national security advisor
to
Biden, a native son of Minnesota, I should say.
No.
Yeah.
I'm saying I don't have these opinions. I'm just trying to paint this Jake here. And then the other thing I'll say is that is going back to what I said at the beginning of this fear of escalation. Sometimes Nasty and I would play out this disagreement in miniature because I also have very real fears of annihilation, and I think most people should. And I think it still does dictate a lot of U.S. behavior. But Anastasiia brought up to me once that there is a Ukrainian idea that we are already being killed and annihilated. So what does it matter to us if it's by tactical nuclear weapon or a massacre in a town? And so there's that disagreement too. So I think I'll stop where I began, which is the U.S. and Western response has been completely motivated by a fear of escalation. Again, it's looking at the conflict and all Ukrainian things through Russian lenses.
Nastia, I suspect you have thoughts on the Biden administration, and so I'm curious your thoughts. But I was curious what Ukraine's thoughts.
That's more important than my thoughts. So the last weeks and the last months of the Biden White House were very starking to watch because the Biden administration went on this PR campaign a little bit, and they all gave these speeches and interviews, basically defending their legacy, and talking about how Blinken, I think, told the New York Times that he stands by all of their choices and he thinks that it was a success, and the entire administration basically hailed their response to the war as an all-out success. And every time they said that, they mentioned Russia. They mostly spoke about Russia, not Ukraine. And they said things like, we denied Putin a victory. I mean, Biden famously said at the debate that he stopped Putin, which many people in Ukraine really laughed at that. Very interesting, just words by Biden there. But it's just so interesting that they see it as a complete success. And then when you talk to Ukrainians, and not even civilians who are suffering from the war every day, but kind of I guess less emotional, if you will, the civil society community and the analysts and the Ukrainian intelligentsia that's analyzing everything that's happening, they see it as a failure, and they see Biden's response as a total failure, because we think that the U.S. was way overly cautious about Putin's red lines and this fear of escalation, which is why we call the show escalation. And we already got some Ukrainians mad about it because we hate the word escalation. But that's the whole point of why we call the show like that, to highlight the irony and the absurdity of this focus on avoiding escalation at all costs by the Americans. But the U.S. just was constantly focused about not crossing some line that Putin said. And if we send long-range weapons, Putin is going to resort to the nukes. Then that doesn't happen. If Ukraine starts attacking Crimea with American weapons, Putin is going to resort to the nukes, and then that doesn't happen. If we send Ukrainian tanks, if we send American tanks to Ukraine, Putin is going to use the nukes. And then 3 years in, we are using American and European weaponry to invade Russian territory. We occupied a chunk of Ukrainian land, and the response is nothing. Like, truly, the Russian response to the Kursk invasion was nothing. They could barely wrap their heads around it for like a month. And so to Ukrainians, that's proof that this fear of escalation focus, and all it did is deny Ukrainians the opportunity to really push the Russians out. Because from a strictly, if you take the politics out of it, which I know you can't, but for a thought experiment, if you just look at the battlefield and you analyze it as a military analyst, time really matters in war. You can't win. Ukrainians could have never won this in the constraints that were put on us by the US. You can't win when you're told that you can't use American weapons to destroy Russian weapons storage in Russia, because that's crossing the line between that Russian territory. Even though all of the weapons that are being sent at us daily are on that territory. You can just go down the line. I can talk about this for hours and give these examples, and all of them are absurd from a military point of view. But because it's political and because there's a relationship to manage and escalation fears, we arrive here. And so, there's a very stark contrast there with perception.
Yeah, if I could just add to this. I think our diplomacy, our military responses, and so on, these days are just not fit for purpose in many ways. I mean, obviously, there was some really helpful diplomacy done during the Biden administration on a number of fronts, but I think Nastya is absolutely right. There was a slow rolling that was not necessarily deliberate, except to a certain extent. It was deliberate, of course, but it looked nefarious from Ukrainian and this view of Ukrainian supporters. And I think we make this mistake over and over again in not responding quickly enough and immediately to these situations. You're preferably anticipating and preventing in the first place, but also responding assertively, constructively to the extent we can, but immediately afterwards. And in each of these cases, 2014 and this time, the response, although the sanctions were really powerful at the beginning and impressive, there was a huge legal response, there was a huge, to a certain extent, there was somewhat of a military response, but that withholding of weapons was really debilitating. And the repeated over 3-year period was just devastating.
So I want to make sure, and then folks should start thinking of questions. But before we do that, I do want to ask sort of one very simple question. What the hell is currently happening? So I don't know how many people have watched the Oval Office interview between Ukrainian President Zelensky and then President Trump and Vice President Vance. I watched 90 seconds and then had to turn it off. I have a very low tolerance for awkwardness on television, so I could not watch it, but I did read the transcript. What is going on, right? Because in my understanding, right before that, there was an agreement that Ukraine would the U.S. could get some minerals from Ukraine, which is its own quite distasteful arrangement, but whatever, right? Whatever, it is what it is, right? And then we're going to sign that, and then we weren't going to sign that because the Oval Office thing blew up. But then a day later, it was going to be okay, and now we're negotiating. I'm very confused.
And in between that, aid was cut off.
Yeah.
Sharing.
So I'm going to ask Nastya, and then everyone can just jump in, and then we'll go to questions. What is currently happening?
Sorry, did you set this up as a simple question?
Yeah, exactly. What is currently happening? I am utterly confused.
You have 90 seconds.
Yes, you have 90 seconds.
Okay. So my read of the situation is that Trump actually doesn't care about Ukraine. What he cares is the American relationship with Russia. And so the war in Ukraine, in his mind, is a very annoying inconvenience that has to be wrapped up as soon as possible. Which is why he's pushing for the ceasefire that's going to be utterly useless, because not shooting for 30 days isn't going to fix a single underlying issue for why the war began. Continues to this day. And
what is the latest on the ceasefire? Do we have any sense of whether there's going to be even one of these useless ceasefires, let alone just the status quo?
So Ukraine agreed to this 30-day ceasefire that that's unconditional, immediately would go in effect as soon as the Russians agreed. Of course, the Russians didn't agree, but Putin kind of dressed his no as a yes, and a bunch of American media fell for it. But what actually happened is the Russians rejected the ceasefire offer because Putin gave on this rant about all of the kind of concessions that he would want out of Ukraine first. So, for example, he said that he basically made it clear that he would want Ukraine to not receive any military aid and not be able to mobilize during this 30-day pause, which is interesting because basically for 30 days, we can't do anything to help our defense, but the Russians can just keep pumping out weapons in their factories and mobilizing people. And, so obviously absurd. The latest is that there is supposed to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's supposed to be a call between Trump and Putin tomorrow to talk about this ceasefire. And so something is going to come out of that. But so in terms of the whole thing and, the Oval Office and everything, what's happening is that the US is hoping to normalize relations with Russia, probably because they buy into this grand vision that they can be friends with Russia and Russia will help them to, counter China. I know a lot of people who think that's bogus. But there's also obviously a financial incentive involved, trading with Russia, normalizing relations with Russia, business opportunities, etc. And so Ukraine in that game is just, let's wrap it up as soon as possible and not have it as an issue. And so Trump is just gonna try to do whatever he can to wrap it up quickly. And when it doesn't work, because ultimately it can't be solved quickly unless we capitulate. He might just blame the whole thing on us. And he might just say that Ukrainians don't want peace and Ukrainians are the problem. And so you guys figure yourself out and we're going to go and do deals and Arctic stuff.
Do either of you want to jump in terms of how you see the current situation, and then we'll go to questions?
One question that's really interesting is that Trump and Zelensky actually sort of seem to get along for months, starting during UN General Assembly meetings in New York when Trump and Zelensky met at Trump Tower in September of last year. And then there were various signs that Trump was impressed by Zelensky and by Ukrainians and may take a more supportive position. He brought in a couple of Russia hawks into his administration. So there were some signs of that. And it just sort of shifted 180 degrees in January, late January, early February, and back to the old model of Trump and Putin getting along. And it's interesting, I haven't seen a good exploration yet of why that happened. Was this a deliberate strategy for months before the election and thereafter? Because it wasn't just before the election; it was also for the first couple of months after the election to seem like there may be more openness to Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. And that's I think that's still an open question, like in terms of what is happening and why we're confused. That's part of what's happening. Plus, the U.S. public support is still very strong in favor of Ukraine. The latest University of Maryland poll shows that U.S. public support for Ukraine has not decreased since last summer, even with the just absolute pounding that Trump and his acolytes have done of Ukraine in the last 6 weeks. Well, less than 6 weeks even.
I would just add, a few more things on the table. I think none of which are mutually exclusive with what's. I think there's a lot of things happening. I think one is that this is another manifestation of Trump's grievance-based politics. If you were able to stomach the Oval Office meeting or read the transcript, he very big in his mind was the Russia hoax. I think he name-checked Robert Mueller. He talked about Clinton and Biden figured very prominently. So I think that episode is still very, very looms large in his mind. And I also think it's a representative of his transaction-based politics as well. I mean, I think he sees the world as a series of bilateral deals and side deals, and you should always be angling for a better deal. So I think that's also led to some of the chaos. And then I think also what's at play here is that I agree. I don't think he really cares about ending the war. I think he cares about getting credit for ending the war and winning like a Nobel Peace Prize or something like that. I think that's like motivating, honestly, a lot of what's happening. And because of that, I think he's looking around and seeing, of the two parties, Russia and Ukraine, who do we, the Americans, have more leverage on? Well, it's our client state in his mind. So we'll turn off the tap, we'll squeeze them, bring them to the table, and then I'll get the Nobel Peace Prize.
Trump winning a Nobel was not on my bingo card. Stranger things have happened. Okay, so I think there's a microphone somewhere for questions. Was there a microphone? No, there's no microphone. There's a microphone. You know what? You people can just use their voice. It's not a big room. So if folks have questions, I think we have time for a couple. I will just say, as I always do with these things, questions should be short, on topic, and they should end with a question mark. Yes, question.
So I have a question about what can be done. Speaking on a personal level, I'm no longer afraid of the United States not doing enough for Ukraine. Now it's kind of a fear of the United States becoming an ally to Russia. The fears have developed, and the United States is more than just the people at the top. There's people, here at the bottom. And what is it that we can do in order to support Ukraine, in order to try to push the United States towards being more proactive and effective in its management of helping Ukraine?
Well, the single most useful thing you can do is donate to the Ukrainian military. So look up Foundation Come Back Alive, and whenever you have $5 or $10 or $15 to spare, donate to them. In terms of the domestic American reality, Tyler, do you have thoughts?
Viola, do you have time?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for the question, and that expresses, an intent to try to do something. And I think a lot of Americans are very skeptical about the value of approaching members of Congress, especially when it seems, like they're just absolutely determined to go in a particular direction. But it actually makes more difference than a lot of Americans understand. Calls and letters and emails to members of Congress actually do get counted and do get tracked. And it's important on a number of levels. It lets them know that people are watching and are concerned and are not going to let go. And are not going to just sit back. So I think that's really important. There tend to be more calls to members of Congress from Republicans than Democrats. So to the extent that there are Republicans who are supporting Ukraine, obviously would want those kind of you would want those kind of calls to continue, but also. It's really important to be active and to keep in touch with and talk with your neighbors and friends. People, Americans have this tradition of not trying to talk politics because it's impolite. That ship has sailed. I think we really need to figure out how to do it in a constructive way, a more constructive way than we often are able to do, because some of this comes from emotion, which is absolutely understandable. But I think constructive communication, trying to understand and persuade, I don't mean just, be accepting of a totally bankrupt point of view, obviously, but helping people to understand why this is in American interests and what the ramifications are for us on a day-to-day level in the future. Because this is a long game, and it's important that people understand that just because we're comfortable today doesn't mean we're going to be comfortable tomorrow or next month or next year.
Okay, yeah, all right.
Sorry. I'm interested a little bit in the power dynamics within the government right now in the state, just because it seems that there is, maybe I'm wrong with this, and please correct me if I am, that the US intelligence agencies and armed forces are more predisposed to the historic ties and American interest in protecting Ukraine and limiting the advancement of Russia territorially and politically into Europe. What is their ability during these next 4 years to constrain the ability of the US's kind of like retreat from that historical position? Is there any possibility, or is that completely out the window?
Sorry, from which perspective?
So if I get the to make sure I understand the question, which I think is a very interesting one, is the US government is a they, not an it, right? It has many constituent parts, and one of those parts is the military intelligence community, which probably has a lot of people that are pro-Ukraine, but their boss is, and their boss's bosses is J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, right? So what, if anything, can be done in the quote-unquote deep state, right, to constrain this shift to Russia? And I will just add, because there's an interesting normative question, and I'll take a position of privilege here as a guy who teaches con law, right? Should they, right? Given that we had a civilian control of the military is also an important value in a democratic system.
Can I jump in just very quickly? You mentioned that the military and the intelligence community kind of understands this history and understands the American interests in Ukraine. So to my knowledge and my best understanding, it was actually the American military that, since the full-scale invasion began, was pushing for biggest caution and was the body that was slowing everything down the most. It was DoD. It wasn't Jake Sullivan or Biden, although they have their own things that they've done. But in terms of just the perception of interest and supporters, which Biden was the biggest supporter of Ukraine, it was the military, as far as I know, was actually the thing that slowed everything down, because they had to prepare for all other contingencies all around the world. And they didn't love the fact that they had to ship all of their stuff from other places to Ukraine. So just that aspect of it, which I think is interesting. But
yeah, I would just throw one thing on the table. Your question might, if I'm understanding it right, might be more of an intra-executive branch question, but I think Congress also has a big role to play in its oversight function. I mean, we keep getting these drips of very troubling news and reports of, for example, I forget the military or CISA or someone is no longer tracking Russian cyber threats. And so I think Congress has a role to play in demanding answers and the reasons behind that, and pushing the executive branch on why they're doing that, why they're underestimating the Russian threat or changing our policy exactly. So I think there's also a role for the other branch to play.
So I think we have time for just one last quick question and a quick answer. Yes, ma'am.
After this disastrous White House meeting, Zelensky was welcomed by European leaders, and they have put on, a couple of shows of their intention to do something. And I'd be interested in hearing, could you give us your perspective on whether or not that gives Ukrainians any comfort, or how we should look at what is, I think, so far kind of shows?
Spot on. That's kind of how we feel about it. Ukrainians have very little comfort on all fronts right now. Our history with the US is complicated, but our history with Europe is sort of equally, if not kind of worse. If you look at, back at 2014, and the role that Europe played, or actually did not play, in helping us then. So we do understand that our kind of lost hope here in terms of the international support, that our last hope is that Europeans get together and figure it themselves out. But whatever it is that they do is going to take years one way or another. I mean, you can't, weapons just don't appear out of thin air, even if you have all the money that you need. So we do understand that, our best hope here is Europe, but I don't think a lot of Ukrainians are kind of betting on that way too much, because it's the best approach right now for the Ukrainian government and for the people is to prepare for the worst possible scenario that can happen and write off that. And then if Europe becomes helpful, great. But if not, then we have a plan for them. So.
Well, I think that preparing for the worst and hoping for the best may be the best that can be done. And so I think it's a good place to end it. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our